The year was 1858, and the Kansas Territory was bleeding. Not the slow, dignified bleeding of a wounded soldier who knows his time has come, but the violent, chaotic hemorrhaging of a land torn between two visions of what America should be. They called it Bleeding Kansas, and they were right to call it that. The soil had drunk so much blood that some said it would never grow clean wheat again. Some said the earth itself had developed a taste for violence, that the prairies remembered every drop spilled upon them, every scream that echoed across those endless horizons. It was in this time, in this troubled land, that the Mercer family arrived at their new farm. They came from Pennsylvania, where the mills had failed, and the future looked as gray as the smoke that poured from factory chimneys. Thomas Mercer had heard that Kansas offered land, opportunity, a chance to build something with his own two hands. He was 34 years old, with shoulders like an ox, and hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work. His wife, Elizabeth, was 32, still beautiful despite the hardships of their journey west, her dark hair always pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic. They brought with them their 3 children, Samuel, age 12, serious beyond his years, Margaret, age 9, who still believed in magic, and little Thomas Jr., just 6 years old, who everyone called Tommy. The farm sat 15 miles west of Lawrence, far enough from civilization that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles distant. It was 160 acres of good flat land, or so the land agent had promised. There was a house, 2 stories of weathered clapboard that leaned slightly to the east, as if tired of standing against the prairie wind. There was a barn, red paint, peeling like sunburnt skin. There were fields that stretched to the horizon, and a well that the previous owner swore gave the sweetest water in all of Kansas. What the land agent had not mentioned, what perhaps he did not know, was why the previous owner had abandoned the property so suddenly. The man's name had been Josiah Crane, and he had left in the middle of the night in October of 1857, taking nothing with him but the clothes on his back and a wild look in his eyes. The neighbors who had seen him ride past at dawn said he was muttering to himself, said his lips moved constantly, as if in prayer or argument, with someone no one else could see. He had not stopped to say goodbye. He had not come back for his belongings. He had simply vanished into the west, and no one had heard from him since. The Mercers arrived in early April, when the prairie was just beginning to wake from winter's grip. The grass was turning green, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that seems to go on forever, so vast and empty that it makes a man feel small, makes him wonder if God is watching from up there, or if God has forgotten this place entirely. Thomas walked the land that first day, ran his hands through the soil, felt its texture, its weight. It was good earth, rich and dark, the kind of earth that should grow wheat as tall as a man's chest. He smiled for the first time in months. Elizabeth cleaned the house, scrubbing years of neglect from the floors and walls. She found things the previous owner had left behind: a broken chair, some rusted tools, a Bible with certain passages underlined so heavily the ink had bled through the pages. She found those passages strange. They were all from the Old Testament, all about sacrifices and offerings, about the Lord demanding the firstborn, about altars built in high places. She put the Bible in a drawer and tried not to think about it. The children explored, as children do. Samuel found an old well behind the barn, covered with rotting boards. Margaret discovered a root cellar that smelled of earth, and something else, something sweetly rotten that made her stomach turn. Tommy found arrowheads in the field, dozens of them, as if a great battle had been fought on this very ground. He collected them in his pockets until his mother made him throw them away, said it wasn't respectful to the dead. They planted wheat that spring. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, breaking the earth with his plow, following behind with the seed bag, walking miles every day until his legs ached and his back screamed. Samuel worked beside him, trying to match his father's pace, trying to be a man before his time. The women tended the house and the vegetable garden, put up preserves, sewed and mended, did the endless work that keeps a family alive on the frontier. The wheat grew well. By June, it was knee-high, a sea of green that rippled in the constant wind. By July, it was waist-high, and Thomas began to dream of a good harvest, of money in his pocket, of security for his family. By August, the wheat had turned golden, and the heads were heavy with grain. It was the finest crop Thomas had ever grown, and he walked through his fields in the evening with pride swelling in his chest, thinking that perhaps Kansas was not such a bad place after all, thinking that perhaps they had finally found their home. It was in September, as the first hints of autumn touched the air, that things began to change. The nights grew cooler, and the wind carried a different sound, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, Thomas thought it was just the wind in the wheat, that particular rustling sound that growing grain makes when the breeze moves through it. But Elizabeth heard it too, and she said it sounded like voices, distant and indistinct, like a crowd of people talking just beyond the edge of hearing. Samuel heard it most clearly. He was sleeping in the attic room, where the sound of the wind was loudest, and he would wake in the night convinced that someone was calling his name. He would go to the window and look out over the wheat fields, and sometimes he thought he could see movement out there, shapes that were darker than the darkness, moving through the grain like swimmers through water. He told his father about it, but Thomas said it was just his imagination, said the prairie played tricks on a person's mind, especially at night, when the emptiness could make you see things that weren't there. But Margaret heard the voices too, and she was not one to imagine things. She heard them in the late afternoon, when the sun was setting, and the wheat turned the color of blood. She heard them whispering, many voices overlapping, speaking in a language she did not recognize. She told her mother, and Elizabeth's face went pale, but she said it was nothing, said it was just the wind, though her hands shook as she said it. Tommy was too young to understand what he was hearing. He thought the voices were friendly, thought they were calling him to come and play. He would wander toward the wheat fields in the evening, and his mother would have to run after him, pull him back, her heart racing with a fear she could not name. She began to keep the doors locked at night, though she could not say what she was trying to keep out. October came, and with it came the harvest. Thomas hired 2 men from Lawrence to help bring in the wheat, 2 weathered farmers named Gideon and Moses, who had lived in Kansas since it was opened to settlement. They arrived at dawn on the 1st of October, their wagon creaking under the weight of scythes and binding twine, their faces serious beneath wide-brimmed hats. They worked all that first day, cutting the wheat in long, sweeping strokes, the sound of the scythes like whispers themselves, like the voices in the field. The work was hard and hot, even in October, and by noon they had filled half the wagon. Thomas was pleased with their progress. At this rate, they would have the entire harvest in before the first frost. But as the sun began to set, Gideon stopped working. He stood in the middle of the field, his scythe hanging loose in his hands, his head tilted, as if listening to something. Moses noticed and called to him, but Gideon did not respond. He just stood there perfectly still, his mouth moving slightly as if he were speaking to someone, though no sound came out. Thomas walked over to him, touched his shoulder, and Gideon jumped as if he had been struck. His eyes were wide and strange, and he looked around as if he did not know where he was. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, but Gideon just shook his head and went back to work, though his hands trembled on the scythe handle. That night, Gideon and Moses slept in the barn, as was customary for hired hands. Thomas offered them space in the house, but they refused, said they preferred the barn, said they were used to it. Elizabeth made them a good dinner, and they ate in silence, neither man speaking much, both of them glancing toward the fields as if expecting to see something there. Samuel brought them coffee after dinner and found them sitting on bales of hay, talking in low voices. He heard Gideon say something about the voices, heard Moses tell him to shut up, to not speak of such things. But Gideon seemed unable to stop. He said he had heard his dead brother out in that field, said he had heard him as clear as day, calling his name the way he used to when they were boys. He said his brother had died in 1856, killed by border ruffians near Lawrence, his body left in a ditch by the side of the road. Moses told him it was just his imagination, that the mind plays tricks when a man works too hard in the sun. But Gideon shook his head, said he knew his brother's voice, said he would know it anywhere, said it had been calling to him from the wheat, telling him to come, to follow, to leave this place and join him wherever he was now. Samuel backed away quietly, not wanting them to know he had been listening. He went back to the house and lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the wheat fields, listening to the voices that rose and fell like waves on an invisible shore. The next morning, Gideon was gone. His bedroll was still in the barn. His tools were still there, but he had vanished. Moses said he must have left in the night, said he was always a strange one, too sensitive for frontier life. But Thomas saw the fear in Moses's eyes, saw the way he kept glancing toward the wheat fields as if they held some terrible secret. They continued the harvest without Gideon, Thomas and Moses and Samuel working side by side. But the work went slower now, and Moses seemed reluctant to go deep into the fields, would only cut the wheat near the edges, near the house where he could see the buildings, as if their sight offered some protection. By the 3rd day of October, Moses could take it no more. He came to Thomas in the evening and said he was leaving, said he would not take his wages, said he just needed to go. Thomas tried to argue with him, tried to convince him to stay, but Moses shook his head. He said something was wrong with this land, said he could feel it in his bones, said the wheat should not whisper like that, should not sound so much like voices, so much like the dead crying out from beneath the earth. Thomas told him he was being foolish, but Moses just climbed onto his wagon and drove away, whipping his horses harder than necessary, as if afraid that something might follow him from the Mercer farm. And so, Thomas was left to bring in the harvest alone, with only Samuel to help him. Elizabeth begged him to stop, to leave the wheat standing, to forget about it and move on. But Thomas refused. He had worked too hard, had invested too much. This wheat represented their survival, their future. He would not abandon it because of some fool superstition, some trick of the wind and imagination. But even Thomas could not deny what he heard as they worked deeper into the field. The voices were there, constant now, speaking in that strange overlapping way. Dozens of voices, perhaps hundreds, all talking at once in a language that was almost but not quite English. Sometimes he could almost make out words. Sometimes he heard his own name. Once, he thought he heard his father's voice, though his father had been dead for 10 years, buried in Pennsylvania soil. Samuel heard them too, and he was terrified. He worked close to his father, never more than an arm's length away, his eyes constantly scanning the wheat around them as if expecting something to emerge from it. The wheat was tall, over 6 feet in places, and when they walked through it, they could see nothing but the golden stalks surrounding them. could see nothing of the house or barn or sky, only wheat, endless wheat, and the voices that seemed to come from the wheat itself. On the 5th of October, they found something in the field. It was near the center, in a place where the wheat grew particularly thick. At first, Thomas thought it was a stone, but when he bent to examine it, he realized it was a skull, human and ancient, half buried in the earth. He stood up quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. Samuel saw it too, and backed away, his face white as milk. They dug around it carefully, and they found more bones, many more. There were dozens of skeletons buried there, layered one atop another, some lying in strange positions as if they had been placed there deliberately. Some of the bones showed signs of violence, skulls crushed or broken, ribs shattered. Some were small, the bones of children. All of them were old, older than any settlement in Kansas, perhaps older than Kansas itself. Thomas stood in that field, surrounded by the bones of the dead, surrounded by the whispering wheat, and he finally understood. This land had been a killing ground. Something terrible had happened here, long before the white man came, perhaps centuries before. The earth remembered. The earth held onto those deaths, the way soil holds onto seeds, waiting for the right season to bring them forth again. He wanted to leave then, wanted to gather his family and run, but where would they go? They had no money, no prospects, nothing but this farm and the wheat that grew on it. So he made a decision. He would finish the harvest, sell the wheat, use the money to buy land somewhere else, somewhere clean, somewhere the earth had not drunk so much blood. But the voices had other ideas. That night, as the family lay sleeping, Tommy woke to hear someone calling his name. It was a soft voice, gentle and kind, the voice of a woman singing a lullaby. He climbed out of bed and walked to the window, drawn by that voice, compelled by it. He could see a figure standing in the wheat field, a woman in a white dress, her arms outstretched as if waiting to embrace him. He climbed out the window onto the porch roof, then jumped down into the yard, landing softly in the dust. The woman in white was still there, still calling to him, and he walked toward her like a sleepwalker, like a child in a dream. The wheat parted before him, and the voices surrounded him, speaking now in English, now in that other language, speaking words of welcome and hunger and ancient need. Elizabeth woke to find Tommy's bed empty and his window open. She screamed, and Thomas bolted from the bed, and they both ran outside in their night clothes, calling their son's name. Samuel and Margaret woke and joined them, and they all ran toward the wheat field, toward the place where they could hear Tommy calling back to them, his voice high and frightened now, as if he had woken from his trance and realized where he was. They found him standing in the center of the field, surrounded by the bones they had uncovered, his small body shaking with cold and fear. The wheat around him was moving, though there was no wind, and the voices were so loud now that they seemed to come from the earth itself, from the air, from everywhere at once. Tommy was crying, saying he wanted to go home, saying the voices wanted him to stay, wanted him to lie down with them in the earth, wanted him to become part of the harvest. Thomas grabbed his son and ran, carrying him back to the house, while Elizabeth and the older children followed, all of them running as if pursued by devils. They locked the doors and windows, and they huddled together in the main room, listening to the voices outside, listening to the wheat rustling and whispering, listening to the sound of footsteps on the porch, though when Thomas looked out, there was nothing there. That night, Elizabeth found the Bible she had hidden in the drawer, the one with the underlined passages. She read them aloud by candlelight, her voice shaking, and Thomas understood now why the previous owner had marked them. They were all about blood offerings, about the price of living on cursed ground, about the demands of angry gods and restless dead. Josiah Crane had understood what this place was, had perhaps tried to appease it, and when that failed, he had fled. The voices continued all night, calling to them, promising things if they would only come outside, threatening things if they remained inside. Margaret covered her ears and cried. Tommy shook with fever, though his skin was cold to the touch. Samuel sat by the door with his father's rifle across his knees, though what good would bullets do against voices, against the dead who spoke from beneath the earth? Dawn came slowly, painfully slowly, and with it came a temporary silence. The voices faded as the sun rose, and the wheat stopped its unnatural movement. The family sat exhausted in their barricaded house, not speaking, not moving, just grateful for the light. Thomas made a decision. They would leave today, right now, would take the wagon and the horses and whatever they could carry and go. The wheat could rot in the field for all he cared. Their lives were worth more than any harvest, any money. But when he went to harness the horses, he found them dead in the barn, their bodies cold and stiff, though there was no mark on them, no sign of how they had died. Their eyes were open and glazed, and their mouths were frozen open, as if they had been screaming. They were trapped, 15 miles from the nearest town, with no horses, with children too small to walk that distance. With October cold settling over the prairie, Thomas tried to think, tried to plan, but his mind felt slow and thick, as if the air itself had become heavy with dread. That day, they stayed inside. They ate what food they had. They prayed, though prayer felt hollow in this place, felt like shouting into a void that would not answer. They waited for night to come, knowing what night would bring, knowing the voices would return. And return they did, as the sun set and the shadows grew long. The voices came back stronger than before, more insistent, and now they spoke in a language the family could understand. They called to each member of the family by name. They spoke in the voices of people the Mercers had known, people who had died. Thomas heard his father promising him prosperity if he would only come outside. Elizabeth heard her mother, dead in childbirth years ago, begging her to bring the children out into the wheat, saying it was warm there, saying there was no pain, only peace. The children heard playmates who had died of fever, of accidents, of all the ways children die on the frontier. The voices promised games and laughter, promised an end to hunger and cold and fear. They promised that death was not terrible, that it was a release, that beneath the earth in the dark soil there was rest, there was community, there was a harvest of souls that went on forever. Tommy almost went to them. He walked to the door and put his hand on the latch, and only Samuel's quick action stopped him, grabbing his brother and pulling him back. Tommy fought him, saying he wanted to go, saying the voices were his friends, saying they were lonely without him. On the 7th day of October, Samuel found his father's journal. Thomas had been writing in it every night, recording everything that had happened, perhaps hoping that someone would find it one day and understand, perhaps simply because he needed to put the horror into words, needed to make it real by writing it down. Samuel read the journal by candlelight while the voices called from outside, and he learned things his father had not told the family. Thomas had gone into town 3 days before the harvest, had spoken to an old man who lived near Lawrence, a man who had been in Kansas since the territorial days. This old man had known about the Mercer farm, had warned Thomas not to stay there. He had told Thomas that the Kaw people who once lived in the region had abandoned this particular piece of land generations ago, had declared it cursed, had said that the earth there was hungry, that it demanded blood. He had told Thomas that every white settler who had tried to farm that land had either died or fled, had said that Josiah Crane was just the latest in a long line of doomed men. The old man had told Thomas about a massacre that had happened there, back in the time before written records, when the tribes still controlled the prairie. 2 tribes had gone to war, and this place had been the battlefield. Hundreds had died, and their bodies had been left to rot where they fell, had been plowed into the earth by time and weather. The old man said the land remembered, said it fed on those deaths, said it grew hungry every autumn when the harvest came, said it wanted more blood, more voices to add to its terrible chorus. Thomas had not believed him. Thomas had thought it was just superstition, just the ravings of an old man who had been on the frontier too long. But he had written it all down in his journal, and now Samuel read it and understood that his father had known, had suspected, and had stayed anyway, had gambled their lives on the hope that the old man was wrong. On the 8th day of October, the voices changed. They stopped calling, stopped promising. They began to threaten. They said the Mercers had taken from the land, had cut the wheat that grew from the bones of the dead, had harvested what was never theirs to take. They said the debt must be paid. They said the land demanded its due. That night, something tried to get into the house. They heard it on the porch, heard it trying the doors, heard it circling the house like a predator. They could not see what it was, but they heard its footsteps, heavy and slow, heard its breathing, deep and ragged. Tommy screamed, and Margaret fainted, and Elizabeth held her children and prayed in a whisper, the same prayer over and over, though the words seemed to have no power here. Thomas stood at the door with his rifle, but he did not shoot. What good were bullets against the dead? What good was a gun against voices, against hunger that came from the earth itself? He stood there until dawn, shaking with exhaustion and fear, and when the sun finally rose, the footsteps stopped, and the house was silent again. On the 9th day of October, they tried to leave on foot. They packed what they could carry and started walking east, toward Lawrence, toward civilization, toward help. But they had not walked half a mile when the wheat began to move. It parted in front of them, and it closed behind them, and they found themselves walking in circles, always ending up back at the house, no matter which direction they thought they were going. The prairie that had seemed so flat and open now seemed like a maze, and they were lost in it, lost on their own land, lost in the wheat that whispered and called and promised terrible things. They stumbled back to the house as the sun set, exhausted and terrified, and they barricaded themselves inside again. That night, the voice that spoke was different from the others. It was old, impossibly old, and it spoke in a language that none of them understood, but that they all somehow comprehended. It told them the story of this place, told them about the blood that had been spilled here, about the deaths that had soaked into the soil, about the hunger that could never be satisfied, only temporarily sated. It told them that every autumn, when the wheat was ready for harvest, the land demanded payment. It told them that Josiah Crane had understood this, had tried to pay with animals at first, had slaughtered chickens and pigs, and eventually his horses had spilled their blood on the wheat fields, trying to satisfy the hunger. But animal blood was not enough. The land wanted what it had been given before, what it had feasted on in that ancient massacre. It wanted human voices, human blood, human souls to add to its collection. The voice told them that Crane had fled because he had no one to give. He had been alone, and he could not sacrifice himself. But the Mercers were not alone. The Mercers had children. The Mercers could pay the price and live here in peace, could harvest their wheat and prosper, if only they would make the offering that the land demanded. Thomas listened to this with his hands over his ears, trying to block it out. But the voice was inside his head now, inside all their heads, speaking directly to their minds. Elizabeth sobbed and held her children, and the children cried and asked what they had done wrong, asked why God had abandoned them to this place. On the 10th day of October, Thomas tried to burn the wheat. He took a torch and ran into the field, setting fire to the dry stalks, watching them catch and burn, the flames spreading quickly in the autumn wind. The wheat burned, and the voices screamed, a terrible chorus of agony and rage that seemed to shake the earth itself. The family watched from the house as the fields turned into an inferno, and they dared to hope that perhaps this would end it, that fire would cleanse what prayer could not. But when the fire burned out, when the smoke cleared, the wheat was still there. Not a single stalk had been touched by the flames. The fire had been an illusion, or the wheat had grown back instantly, or perhaps the wheat could not be destroyed by any earthly means. It stood there, golden and whispering, as if mocking their attempt at resistance. That night, Samuel disappeared. Elizabeth had fallen asleep for just a moment, exhausted beyond endurance, and when she woke, her eldest son was gone. They found him in the wheat field, standing among the bones, his eyes glassy and distant. He was speaking in a language none of them recognized, and when Thomas tried to bring him back, Samuel fought like a wild animal, his strength inhuman, his voice not his own. They wrestled him back to the house, and they tied him to a chair, and they watched as their son writhed and spoke in voices that were not his, as dozens of different people seemed to speak through him, using his mouth, his voice, his body as a vessel. He spoke in English and French and Spanish and languages that had been dead for centuries. He spoke as a child and as an old man, as a woman in labor, and as a soldier dying on a battlefield. He was possessed by the voices, by the harvest, by all the souls that the land had collected over the centuries. Margaret could not bear to watch. She went upstairs to her room and closed the door, and she lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to her brother screaming downstairs, listening to the voices that came from his mouth, listening to her parents crying and praying. She was 9 years old, and she understood now that they were going to die here, all of them, that the land would take them one by one, until there was nothing left but more voices in the wheat, more souls added to the terrible harvest. On the 11th day of October, Elizabeth made a decision. She could not watch her children suffer anymore. She could not watch them be taken by this place, twisted and destroyed by whatever evil lived in the soil. She went to the kitchen and found the laudanum she kept for headaches, and she mixed it into milk, and she gave it to Margaret and Tommy, telling them it would help them sleep, telling them everything would be better in the morning. Thomas found her as she was preparing her own dose, and he understood what she was doing, and he did not stop her. He sat with her at the kitchen table, and they held hands, and they talked about Pennsylvania, about the life they had left behind, about the hopes and dreams that had brought them to Kansas. They did not speak of regret, because regret was a luxury they could no longer afford. They had made their choices, and now they would face the consequences. But before they could drink the poison, Samuel stopped screaming. The voices that had been speaking through him fell silent, and he slumped in his chair, unconscious but breathing. The house became quiet, unnaturally quiet, and Thomas went to the window and looked out at the wheat fields. The wheat had stopped moving. The voices had stopped calling. The night was still and silent as a grave. For a moment, Thomas dared to hope. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps whatever power held them had exhausted itself, had given up, had moved on to torment some other unfortunate family. But then he saw movement at the edge of the wheat field, and his blood turned to ice. They were coming out of the wheat. Figures, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They were the color of the earth. their bodies twisted and broken, their movements jerky and wrong. Some were nearly complete, with recognizable features and clothing. Others were just bones animated by some terrible will, clattering across the ground like wind-up toys. They came from the wheat, and they surrounded the house, and they stood there in the moonlight, waiting. Thomas woke Elizabeth, and they gathered their remaining children, and they stood together in the center of the main room, holding each other, waiting for whatever would come next. The figures outside did not try to enter. They simply stood there, patient and eternal, a silent reminder of what the land would eventually claim. Samuel woke just before dawn. He was himself again, or something close to himself. He looked at his parents with eyes that had seen too much, that had touched something beyond human comprehension. He told them what the voices had shown him while he was possessed. He told them about the massacre that had happened here, about warriors killing each other until the ground was soaked with blood, about women and children hiding in the wheat, being found and slaughtered. He told them about how the land had drunk all that death, had absorbed it, had been fundamentally changed by it. He told them that this place was a wound in the world, a place where the barrier between life and death had been torn, where the voices of the dead could reach through and touch the living. He told them that the wheat was not really wheat, or not only wheat. It was a manifestation of the land's hunger, a crop that grew from death itself, roots reaching down into the bones of centuries, drawing sustenance from old sorrows and old rage. He told them that the land would never let them go, not unless they gave it what it wanted, and what it wanted was a willing sacrifice, a life freely given, not taken. The land was tired of violence, tired of blood spilled in anger. It wanted devotion, wanted worship, wanted someone to choose death to feed the harvest. Thomas listened to his son, and he understood what he had to do. He had brought his family to this place, had ignored the warnings, had gambled with their lives and lost. The debt was his to pay. He kissed Elizabeth, held her while she cried, and begged him not to go. He embraced his children, told Samuel to take care of his mother, told Margaret and Tommy that he loved them, that everything he had done was because he wanted a better life for them. And then, as the sun began to rise on the 12th day of October, Thomas Mercer walked out into the wheat field. He walked to the center, to the place where the bones lay uncovered, and he knelt among them. The figures that had surrounded the house parted to let him pass, and then they followed him, a silent procession of the dead. He knelt there, and he prayed, and he told the land that he offered himself willingly, that his family had done no wrong, that they should be allowed to leave in peace. The wheat began to move around him, the stalks bending and wrapping around his body like arms, like embraces. The voices returned, but they were gentle now, almost kind. They welcomed him, thanked him, told him his sacrifice was accepted. He felt the earth beneath him begin to soften, felt himself sinking slowly into it, felt the soil rising to cover him like a blanket. He did not fight it. He closed his eyes and thought of Elizabeth, of his children, of the future they would have without him. From the house, Elizabeth and the children watched. They saw Thomas disappear into the wheat, saw the stalks bend and cover him, saw the earth swallow him whole. Margaret screamed, and Tommy cried, but Samuel held them, told them it was what their father wanted, that he had made this choice to save them, and then it was over. The wheat stood still and golden in the morning light. The figures of the dead were gone, vanished back into the earth. The house no longer felt oppressed, no longer felt like a prison. The air itself seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from the land. The family left that same day, walking east toward Lawrence, carrying only what they could hold in their arms. This time, the wheat did not trap them. This time, the land let them go. They walked for hours in silence, not looking back, not speaking of what they had witnessed. Elizabeth held Tommy's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white, terrified that if she loosened her grip even for a moment, he too would be claimed by that hungry earth. Margaret walked with her eyes on the ground, counting her steps, using numbers to keep the voices at bay, to keep herself from thinking about her father disappearing into the wheat, about the way the earth had opened to swallow him like a mouth. Samuel carried what little they had managed to salvage, his young shoulders bent under the weight of responsibility that was too heavy for a 12-year-old boy, knowing that he was the man of the family now, knowing that his father had died so that he could live. They reached Lawrence as the sun was setting, stumbling into town like refugees from a war, which in a way they were. The town was busy with evening traffic, people going about their normal lives, buying supplies, greeting neighbors, laughing and talking as if the world made sense, as if horror was something that happened only in stories. Elizabeth found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, a round-faced woman with kind eyes who asked no questions when she saw the state they were in, who simply showed them to a room and brought them soup and bread. That night, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, they slept without hearing the voices. The silence was almost as terrible as the sounds had been, because in the silence they could think, could remember, could process what they had endured. Samuel lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, seeing his father's face, hearing his father's last words. Margaret cried herself to sleep, her small body shaking with sobs that she tried to muffle in her pillow. Tommy had nightmares, woke screaming that the wheat woman was calling him, and Elizabeth held him until dawn, rocking him and singing lullabies in a voice that cracked with grief. In the morning, they went to the land office and Elizabeth sold the farm. The agent was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and he seemed surprised that she wanted to sell so quickly, that she did not even want to go back for their belongings. She told him her husband had died, that she needed to return east immediately, that she would take whatever price he could get. The agent offered her $800, less than half what Thomas had paid for the property, and she took it without haggling, signed the papers with a shaking hand, and walked out with the money in her reticule, feeling like she had just made a deal with the devil himself. They used some of the money to buy passage on a stagecoach heading to St. Louis. From there, they would take a riverboat to Cincinnati, and from Cincinnati they would find their way back to Pennsylvania, back to the gray industrial city they had left behind, back to the life they had thought was too small and too hard. It did not seem small now. It did not seem hard. It seemed like paradise compared to the hell they had endured in Kansas. The journey took 3 weeks, and with every mile they traveled, Elizabeth felt the weight on her chest lighten just slightly, felt the voices in her head grow a little more distant, but they never went away entirely. She would wake in the night hearing whispers, would turn quickly on the street, thinking she saw Thomas walking behind her, would smell wheat where there was no wheat, would taste dust and blood and fear in her mouth for no reason at all. The land had marked her, had marked all of them, and that mark would never fully fade. Samuel stopped speaking for nearly a month. He went silent after they left Lawrence, and nothing his mother did could coax words from him. He would nod or shake his head in response to questions, but he did not talk, did not explain, did not share what he had experienced during those hours when the voices possessed him. When he finally spoke again, it was to tell his mother that he had seen things while he was gone, had been shown things by the dead who spoke through him. He said he had seen the massacre that created the curse, had witnessed it as if he were there, had felt the terror of the dying, had experienced their deaths as if they were his own. He said he understood now why the land was the way it was, why it hungered so terribly, why it could never be satisfied. He said the dead were angry, had been angry for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like not to be angry, and all they knew was hunger and rage, and the need to drag the living down into the earth to join them. Margaret became obsessed with cleanliness. She washed her hands constantly, scrubbed them until they were red and raw, as if trying to wash away some invisible contamination. She refused to eat bread, could not bear the smell of flour, would gag and retch if anyone tried to make her consume anything made from wheat. She had nightmares about being buried alive, about the earth pressing down on her, about suffocating in darkness while voices called her name. She would wake screaming, and it would take Elizabeth hours to calm her, to convince her that she was safe, that they were far from Kansas, that the wheat could not reach them here. Tommy stopped believing in God. He was only 6 years old, but he declared with absolute certainty that God did not exist, because if God existed, he would not have let such terrible things happen. He said God would not have made a place like that farm, would not have allowed the earth to be so hungry, would not have taken his father away. Elizabeth tried to comfort him with scripture, with promises of heaven and reunion, but Tommy would shake his head and say that his father was not in heaven, that his father was in the wheat, that his father's voice was now part of the harvest, calling and whispering with all the others for eternity. And the terrible thing was that Elizabeth feared he was right. They arrived in Pennsylvania in early November, just as winter was beginning to settle over the land. Elizabeth found a small house to rent on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, using what was left of the farm money to pay the first 6 months' rent. She found work in a textile mill, the same kind of work she had done before they left, standing at a loom for 12 hours a day, breathing in cotton dust, going home exhausted and hollow-eyed. Samuel found work, too, delivering newspapers in the morning before school, helping to support the family as his father would have wanted. Margaret and Tommy went to school, tried to be normal children, tried to forget what they had seen and heard and experienced, but forgetting was impossible. The farm had changed them in ways that could not be unchanged, had shown them truths about the world that could not be unseen. They knew now that the boundary between life and death was thinner than most people realized, that the earth itself could be alive in terrible ways, that hunger was not just a human condition, but something that existed in the soil itself, in the stones, in the foundations of the world. They knew that some places were wrong, fundamentally wrong, and that those places could consume you if you were not careful, could add your voice to their collection, could make you part of something old and hungry and evil. Elizabeth never remarried. Men approached her over the years, widowers and bachelors who saw a handsome woman living alone and thought they might find companionship or more. But she turned them all away, told them she was not interested, told them she had loved one man, and that was enough for one lifetime. The truth was that she could not bear the thought of loving someone again, of risking that kind of loss again, of watching another person she cared about be swallowed by the world's cruelty. She had used up all her capacity for hope on that farm in Kansas, had left it there in the wheat fields, along with her husband's body and her family's future. She lived quietly, worked hard, raised her children as best she could. She went to church every Sunday, though she prayed with a kind of desperate anger now, demanding answers from a God who seemed to have turned his face away. She read her Bible every night, searching for some explanation, some justification for what had happened to them. But she found nothing that made sense, nothing that explained why good people should suffer so terribly, why evil should be allowed to flourish in the earth. why places like that farm should exist at all. Samuel grew up haunted but functional. He finished the school, found work as a clerk in a shipping office, married a quiet girl named Sarah, who never knew about Kansas, who never knew why her husband sometimes woke screaming in the night, why he refused to eat bread in October, why he would not go near wheat fields, why he flinched when the wind whispered. He had children of his own, 2 daughters, and he was a good father to them, protective and loving, though Sarah sometimes said he held them too tightly, watched them too closely, as if afraid they might vanish if he looked away for even a moment. He never told his children about the farm. He never spoke of his father's sacrifice, never explained why they never visited Kansas, why they never went west at all. He kept those secrets locked inside himself, and they ate at him slowly over the years, wore him down like water on stone, until by the time he was 40, he looked like a man of 60, his face lined and gray, his eyes holding shadows that should not have been there. He died young, at 52, of a heart that simply gave out, and his last words were to his mother, telling her that he could hear the voices again, that they had found him even here, even after all these years, and that they were calling him home. Margaret never recovered. She spent her teenage years in and out of institutions, diagnosed with hysteria and melancholia and half a dozen other ailments that doctors in the late 19th century used to describe women who had seen too much, who knew too much, who had been broken by experiences that proper society pretended did not exist. She would have periods of apparent normalcy, months where she seemed fine, where she could hold a conversation and perform simple tasks and almost be the girl she had been before Kansas. But then something would trigger her, a smell, a sound, a trick of the light, and she would collapse into screaming fits, would tear at her clothes and her hair, would babble about the wheat and the voices and the earth that ate her father, and they would have to sedate her and lock her away again for her own safety. She died in an asylum in 1903 at the age of 54. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, but Elizabeth, who sat with her daughter in those final hours, knew that Margaret had simply given up, had finally surrendered to the darkness that had been chasing her since she was 9 years old. Margaret's last words were not words at all, but a sound, a whisper that might have been the wind or might have been something else, something that sounded like wheat rustling, like voices calling from far away, like the earth finally claiming what it had been owed for 45 years. Tommy fared better than his siblings, at least on the surface. He became a teacher, specialized in history, spent his life studying the past, trying to understand the patterns of violence and tragedy that shaped human civilization. He married late, at 35, to a woman named Catherine, who taught at the same school. They had no children, though not for lack of trying. Catherine miscarried 3 times, and after the 3rd loss, they gave up, accepted that some people were not meant to be parents, though Tommy sometimes wondered if it was not acceptance but curse, if the farm had marked him in ways that made him unfit to pass on life, if whatever had touched him in Kansas had rendered him somehow sterile, somehow toxic. He never told Catherine about the farm, either. He carried the secret like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold, and he tried to make sense of it through his studies, through his teaching, through his endless reading about violence and sacrifice, and the ways that blood soaked into land and changed it. He became an expert on bleeding Kansas, wrote a small book about it that was published by a university press and sold perhaps 500 copies. In that book, there was a single paragraph about cursed places, about locations where violence had been so intense that the land itself seemed to remember, seemed to hunger for more. His colleagues thought it was poetic license, a bit of purple prose to make his academic work more readable. They did not know he was writing from experience. Tommy died in 1937 at the age of 85, one of the few people to live from the Civil War era into the age of automobiles and airplanes and radio. He died peacefully in his sleep, and Catherine said that in his final days he seemed at peace, seemed to have made his reconciliation with whatever demons had chased him through his long life. But his last entry in his personal journal, written the day before he died, told a different story. He wrote that the voices had never stopped, that he heard them still, every autumn, every October, calling to him from across the decades and the miles. He wrote that he had spent his entire life running from that farm, and that he suspected when he died, his soul would not go to heaven or hell, but back to Kansas, back to the wheat fields, back to the place where his father had been swallowed by the earth. He wrote that he hoped he was wrong, but that he feared he was right, and that the farm collected all debts eventually, one way or another. Elizabeth outlived all her children. She died in 1941 at the age of 115, one of the oldest women in Pennsylvania, perhaps in all of America. Newspapers wrote articles about her, asked her the secret of her longevity, and she told them she ate well and walked every day and trusted in the Lord. She did not tell them that she had lived so long because she was too stubborn to die, too angry to give up, too determined to outlast the curse that had taken her husband and slowly destroyed her children. She did not tell them that she had spent 83 years waiting for the voices to come for her, and that they never had, and that this was its own kind of torture, to be spared when everyone she loved had been consumed. In her final hours, lying in a hospital bed, she confessed everything to a young priest who had come to give her last rites. She told him about the farm, about the voices, about Thomas walking into the wheat, about the decades of suffering that followed. The priest listened with the patient tolerance of someone who had heard many deathbed confessions, who assumed this was delirium, the wandering mind of a woman who had lived too long and seen too much. But when she was finished, when she had unburdened herself of 83 years of secrets, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and told him to write it down, to make a record, to warn people about that place. She gave him the exact location, 15 miles west of Lawrence, and she made him promise to tell someone, anyone, to make sure no one ever farmed that land again. The priest promised, and he kept to his promise. He wrote everything down, filed it with the diocesan records, sent a copy to the Historical Society in Kansas. But his report was filed away and forgotten. Just another piece of folklore, just another old woman's story. No one believed it. No one took it seriously. The farm remained on the books, changed hands several more times, each time with the same result. People would buy it, try to work it, and then leave, quickly and quietly, usually in the middle of the night, usually without explanation. The new owners lasted 3 months before they too abandoned the property. And then another family tried, and another, and another. Some left quickly, spooked by the voices. Others stayed longer, trying to make a go of it, trying to convince themselves that the whispers in the wheat were nothing but wind, that the movements in the field at night were just animals, that the hunger they felt emanating from the soil was just their imagination. But every autumn, in October, the land demanded its harvest. Sometimes it took years for a new sacrifice to be made. And in those years, the wheat grew thin and pale, and the voices were angry, violent, destructive. But eventually, someone always paid the price. A child would wander into the wheat and never return. A farmer would go out to inspect his crop and vanish, leaving only his tools behind. A woman would walk into the field in her nightgown and never come back, her body never found, her voice added to the chorus. The farm still stands, even now, though the years have worn it down to little more than a shell. The house leans more than it used to, threatening to collapse in the next strong wind. The barn has lost its roof, and the well has been filled in, but the wheat still grows there every year, even though no one plants it, even though no one tends it. It grows thick and golden, beautiful and terrible, and it whispers when the wind blows through it, whispers in voices that are almost human, that are human, that are all the people who have fed the harvest over the centuries. Locals know not to go there, especially not in October, especially not at night. They tell stories about the farm to their children, use it as a cautionary tale about greed, about ignoring warnings, about the arrogance of thinking you can tame a land that does not want to be tamed. They say that if you stand at the edge of that property on an autumn night, you can hear the voices calling from the wheat, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all the souls that the land has collected, all the voices that have been harvested instead of grain. Sometimes, they say, you can hear Thomas Mercer's voice among them. They say he calls out for his family, calls out their names, asks if they made it home safely, if they lived good lives, if his sacrifice meant something. They say his voice is sad, but not regretful, that he sounds almost at peace, as if he has accepted his place in the eternal harvest, as if he understands that some prices must be paid, some debts must be settled, even if the currency is life itself. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, you can hear something else from that wheat field. You can hear the sound of scything, rhythmic and steady, the sound of harvest happening, even though no one is there, the sound of the land reaping what it has sown in blood and bone and sacrifice. You can hear the wheat falling, and you can hear the voices rising, and if you listen very carefully, you can almost understand what they are saying. They are saying that the land is hungry still. They are saying that the harvest never ends. They are saying that some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, and some fields were never meant to be sown, and some things that grow in the darkness of the earth should be left there, undisturbed, uncultivated, unharvested. They are saying that Kansas remembers, the soil remembers, the wheat remembers. And every autumn, when the air turns cold and the days grow short, the farm that harvests voices instead of wheat wakes up again, opens its mouth, and calls out for more blood, more souls, more voices to add to its terrible chorus, more offerings to feed the hunger that can never be satisfied, only temporarily sated, only briefly silenced before it begins again. And the wheat grows, tall and golden and beautiful, nourished by bones, watered by tears, harvested by death itself. The wheat grows, and it whispers, and it calls, and it waits. It waits for the next family who thinks they can live on cursed ground, who thinks they can ignore the past, who thinks they can harvest from a field that has been sown with the dead. It waits for the next sacrifice, the next voice to add to its collection, the next soul to feed the eternal hunger of the land that remembers, the land that demands, the land that will never ever be satisfied. Some say that if you visit the farm now, you can see the wheat growing even in winter, even in the snow, green and vibrant, when everything else is dead and brown. Some say that if you walk into that field, even in daylight, even in summer, you will hear the voices calling to you, promising things, threatening things, tempting you deeper and deeper until you cannot find your way back out. Some say that people still disappear there, that hikers and hunters and curious teenagers go into that wheat field and never return, their voices added to the chorus, their souls added to the harvest. But these are just stories, of course, just tales told around campfires, just legends whispered in bars, just warnings given to outsiders who ask too many questions about that abandoned farm 15 miles west of Lawrence. Just superstition. Just the fevered imagination of people who have lived too long in a hard land, who have seen too much death, who need to believe that there is some explanation for the tragedies that befall them, some reason beyond simple bad luck or poor judgment. Just stories, just voices in the wind, just wheat growing where wheat should not grow, whispering when wheat should not whisper, calling when wheat should not call. Just a farm, abandoned and forgotten, slowly returning to the earth, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie that surrounds it. Just a place where, on autumn nights, the air feels heavy with old sorrows and old hunger, where the shadows move in ways that shadows should not move, where the ground beneath your feet feels hollow, as if there is something vast and empty beneath it, something waiting, something patient, something that has all the time in the world because it has already been waiting for centuries and can wait for centuries more. Just a farm, just a field, just voices, just wheat, just the harvest, happening again and again and again, forever and ever, world without end. Amen.